several years ago, 4 years I guess now, we got some funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to do an action research project called AFRI, the African Farm Radio Research Initiative. And the aim of that was to develop an approach for creating, producing, and evaluating a radio program, an agricultural program that would be effective for essentially changing behavior of farmers and encouraging them to adopt an improved agricultural practice that they had identified as something that was of need to them. And it took place in 5 countries, and we worked with, in each country we worked with 5 stations, a mixture of, in each country is generally 3 community radio stations, 1 private broadcaster, and then a public broadcaster. And we developed a process which started out with meeting with, well, working with stations so that they would then meet with groups in the community, farmers groups, find out what the needs of the farmers were with respect to agricultural practices, and then develop what we call a participatory radio campaign. So a radio program series that exists over a period of several months that then will address that need that farmers have identified. And what we did in terms of being able to compare results amongst communities who were either listening to the program or not listening to the program, we had 3 sort of designations. We had active listening communities, we had passive listening communities, and we had control communities. And the active listening communities consisted of communities that were involved in the process throughout. They were involved in identifying the agricultural issue, they were involved in participating in the program production, their voices were heard on air, and so they were really engaged throughout the process. The passive listening communities were communities in the broadcast area that could listen to the broadcast but weren't involved in in identifying the problem or on any of the on-air aspects of the program. And then the control communities were communities which could not either listen to the program or they weren't consulted. So not in every case this wasn't exactly possible, but in many cases it was because of the maybe there'd be areas where the broadcast wouldn't reach, or I think that was the main one. We tried to do it based on like topography. And what we found is looking at 15, sort of across 15 of the radio stations that participated, and we did household surveys with 45,000 individuals, and we learned that in terms of active listening communities, 82% of people surveyed in those communities would at least listen to the radio program, versus 62% in the passive listening communities. But then in terms of knowledge, so that's a huge number. So, but that's in terms of listening to it. But then in terms of knowledge gained, and we had processes for determining whether or not people actually retained what they heard, sort of through even like phoning people up or through the household surveys, finding out what they had retained, and we found that in the active listening communities, 70% of people learned something from those programs, and then it was 52% in the passive listening communities. But then when you get to practice, which of the farmers were actually practicing what they heard, in the active listening communities it was around 40%, but in the passive listening communities it was 21%. So that means, I mean, yes, it has decreased, but in terms of it, to us it demonstrates that if a program is done in a certain way, which is participatory, involves people, even if simply just listen to the program, it can have a change. So that's like people who are in the passive listening communities were 5 times more likely to adopt that practice than those that were not able to listen. So that really, for us, is then something that we can take when we go and talk to donors, when we go and talk to other organizations, saying, look, radio, if it's done in a certain way, can be really effective. Because that's something that's really lacked in the area of radio for development is sort of large-scale studies, multi-country, that can really analyze and evaluate this. And so, yes, this is something that we did, but the idea is that other groups that might not have access to funds to do like a large-scale thing can actually say, okay, here is some like evidence that was gathered. So, and we're using it now to approach donors, and we were having some discussion about this over lunch and saying that there are challenges because a lot of donors think, oh, well, a communication part of a project or whatever shouldn't cost much, or they don't really think of the cost involved. And so we've had to do a lot of work in saying, well, actually, if you want it to be something sustained and involve different stakeholders and last over a certain period of time, it does cost a certain amount, but then you're going to get results, which other communication projects would not get these same results. So that there's a bit of work that we're doing there. But,
okay, thank you very much.